Hi friends, welcome to the Modern Learning. Today we are going to read the poem The Listeners. So let's get started. Let's talk about the poet first. Walter John de la Mare, 25 April 1873 to 22 June 1956, was an English poet, short story writer, and novelist. He is probably best remembered for his works for children, for his poem, The Listeners. His style was simple, and the mysteries of magic, the moonlight, and quietness fascinated him greatly. These subjects are introduced in most of his poems. Let's talk about the poem. Walter de la Mare published The Listeners in 1912. It remains one of his most famous pieces of writing and reflects the author's fascination with mystery and the supernatural. It is a 36-line poem which is contained within one block of text. The piece follows a consistent pattern of rhyme in the scheme of A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E, and so on, changing end sounds as the poet saw fit. Let's read the poem from lines 1 to 8. Is there anybody there? Said the traveller, knocking on the moonlit door, and his horse in the silence champed the grasses of the forest's ferny floor. And a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveller's head, and he smote upon the door again a second time. Is there anybody there? He said. Let's paraphrase these lines. An unnamed figure, the traveller, knocks on the door of a house in the moonlight and asks if there is anyone inside. The traveller's horse grazes in the quiet forest while the traveller waits for a response. A bird flies out of a small tower on the house and over the traveller's head. The traveller knocks again, more forcefully, and repeats his question. Let's read the poem from lines 9 to 20. But no one descended to the traveller. No head from the leaf-fringed cell leaned over and looked into his grey eyes, where he stood perplexed and still. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men, stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, hearkening in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveller's call. Let's paraphrase these lines. No one comes down from the house to meet him. However, no one even leans out of the window, the sill of which is covered in the leaves, to look at him. He stands in place, puzzled by the lack of an answer. Inside the house is a group of ghostly beings. These listeners stand in the moonlight as they listen to the human voice coming from outside. The ghostly beings crowd around the staircase onto which moonlight streaks, as the quiet atmosphere in the empty house is disturbed by the sound of the traveller's lonely voice. Let's read the poem from lines 21 to 28. And he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness answering his cry, while his horse moved, cropping the dark turf, 'neath the starred and leafy sky. For he suddenly smote on the door even louder and lifted his head. "Tell them I came and no one answered, that I kept my word," he said. Let's paraphrase these lines. Outside, the traveller senses a strange presence in the silence that meets his question. His horse, undisturbed, continues to graze in the dark forest, the sky above full of stars and obscured by trees. The traveller suddenly beats on the door once again, even more loudly than before. He then calls out, asking whoever is listening to pass on a message that no one answered him when he came to the house, but he kept his promise. Let's read the poem from lines 29 to 36. Never the least stir made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house. From the one man left awake, aye, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. Let's paraphrase these lines. The listeners don't make any motion in response to this. The traveler's words reverberate through the dark, empty house, coming from the only living person around. The phantom listeners hear him jump up onto his horse, and then the sound of the horseshoes on the stone path as the traveler rides away. The silence of the forest quickly returns as the sound of the horse's forceful riding fades away. So let's check out the summary of the poem. The listeners describes a traveler who has come to knock on a moonlit door in an eerie, unknown place. He has come to keep an unnamed promise and knocks on the door harder and harder, but gets no response. A host of phantom listeners are inside but unresponsive to his calls. The traveler finally leaves, but the listeners remain. So friends, this was all about the poem The Listeners. If you liked the video, just give a thumbs up. And for the complete solved exercises, just keep watching. And don't forget to subscribe. See ya!